The signal did not knock, it did not announce itself politely, or wait for anyone to answer. It simply arrived, cutting through every radio frequency, every satellite channel, every military comm line on the planet simultaneously, and in the space of 4 seconds, it ended the era when humanity believed it was alone. I was sitting at my workstation on the 4th floor of the United Nations Communication Analysis Center in Geneva when it happened. My name is Claire Donovan, and I had spent the last 11 years of my life translating noise into meaning. Radio bursts from deep space probes, encrypted government transmissions, signals that bounced between relay stations halfway across the solar system. I was good at my job. I was calm under pressure. I did not panic easily. I panicked. The screens in front of me went white first, all of them, at once. Every monitor in the building, the analyst said later. It lasted exactly 0.4 seconds. Then the signal settled into a pattern, and the pattern settled into language, and the language, somehow, was already translated. That was the part that stopped my blood cold. It was not in English. It was not in any single language. It was in all of them, simultaneously, perfectly. Mandarin and Arabic and Spanish and English and French, layered together like a cord, each thread intact, none interrupting the other. I put on my headset and listened, and this is what I heard. Species designation, human. Planet designation, Earth. Solar system designation, cataloged. You have been assessed. You have been evaluated. You have been found insufficient for independent operation. By the authority of the Kethara Directorate, governing body of the Consolidated Empire, you are hereby given formal notice. You will cease all military development. You will surrender all orbital defense infrastructure. You will await our arrival and present your governing bodies for transition processing. You have 72 hours to comply. Non-compliance will result in pacification. This is not a negotiation. This is a courtesy. Then it stopped. For about 3 seconds, nobody in the building made a sound. Then everyone started talking at once. I ripped my headset off and stood up and looked around the room. People were shouting into phones. Someone knocked over their coffee mug and did not notice. The man at the station beside mine, a senior analyst named Gary Pullman who had worked signals intelligence for 20 years, was sitting very still with his hands flat on his desk, staring at his screen, and his face had gone the color of paper. I understood the feeling. What I had just heard was not a signal from a probe or a random burst from a distant star. It was a message. A precise, deliberate, organized message from something that knew our name, knew our planet, knew our solar system, had evaluated us, and found us lacking, and was now giving us 3 days to submit. 72 hours. I looked at the clock on my wall. It read 08:14 on a Tuesday morning. By Friday morning at 08:14, the Kethara Directorate expected Earth's complete surrender. The next 6 hours were the most disorganized I had ever seen a professional institution become. The Secretary General of the United Nations was rushed to a secure facility. World leaders were scrambling to reach each other on encrypted lines. Every space monitoring agency on the planet was pointing their instruments at the sky, trying to locate the source of the signal, trying to find a ship, a fleet, anything. Nobody found anything. There was nothing to find, or if there was, it was too far away or too well hidden or both. I was reassigned within the hour. They pulled me out of the main analysis floor and put me in a smaller room, deeper in the building, with 6 other people who spoke the most languages combined and had the highest clearance ratings in the department. Our job was simple and terrifying. Listen. Monitor every frequency. Log every repeat transmission. Look for patterns. Look for anything that might tell us what the Kethara actually were, where they came from, how many of them there were, and whether 72 hours meant what it sounded like. It meant exactly what it sounded like. Over the next 2 days, governments fractured along fault lines that had always been there. 12 nations publicly announced they were in favor of compliance. They called it pragmatism. They said we had no context for what the Kethara were capable of, and that resistance without information was the same as extinction. 3 other governments went silent entirely. No official statements, no communications on public channels, as if they had simply switched off. The remaining nations argued. Committees were formed. Emergency sessions were called. People made very passionate speeches that ultimately said nothing at all. I stayed at my workstation and I listened. What I learned, pieced together from fragments of intercepted transmissions and background analysis that my team assembled over those 48 hours, was this. The Kethara were not new. They were not young. They had been doing this for a very long time. Their signal had not been improvised or translated hastily. The linguistic structure was too precise, too perfectly calibrated for every human language at once. That meant preparation. That meant they had been watching us, studying us, cataloging our languages and our cultures and our communication systems, long before they ever announced themselves. How long, we did not know. Long enough. They were called an empire, and they named themselves a directorate, and those words carried weight. An empire implied scale. A directorate implied order. Order implied procedure. And procedure implied that this, the signal, the ultimatum, the countdown, was not something improvised. This was how they worked. This was their process. It made them more frightening, not less. By hour 68, the UN bunker had the quiet, stale smell of people who had not slept in 2 days. I was on my 4th cup of coffee, cross-referencing the transmission frequency logs with a star chart overlay my colleague Dennis Farrow had pulled together, when the secondary alert board lit up. Not an incoming signal this time, an outgoing one. I stared at it. For a moment I thought it was an error, some artifact of the monitoring system, a ghost reading, an equipment fault. But I checked the source tag and the timestamp, and the frequency signature 3 times, and they all said the same thing. At 68 hours, 14 minutes, and 32 seconds after the Kethara ultimatum arrived, something on Earth sent a response. It did not come from Geneva. It did not come from New York, or Beijing, or Washington. It came from a deep space relay station I had never heard of, tagged with a classification string so high that when I ran it through our clearance database, the system did not return an access denied message. It returned nothing. No record, no file, no trace that the classification string even existed. Someone had answered the Kethara, without asking, without a vote or a debate or a committee or a press release. I pulled up the content of the transmission. It was short, remarkably short for something that had just spoken to a 3,000-year-old empire on behalf of all of humanity. It was a set of coordinates. That was it. Nothing else. No message, no greeting. No demand, no explanation. Just a location in space. A precise string of numbers pointing to a system roughly 3 light-years off the approach vector the Kethara signal had come from. I sat back in my chair and looked at those coordinates for a long time. I had spent 11 years in communications. I knew what silence meant. I knew what noise meant. I knew what a message looked like when someone was afraid, and I knew what a message looked like when someone was not. Whoever had sent those coordinates was not afraid. I did not know yet whether that was the most reassuring thing I had ever discovered, or the most terrifying. I would spend the next several weeks figuring out which. I started tracing the origin of that signal at 04:47 in the morning, with cold coffee beside me, and Gary Pullman asleep in his chair 6 feet away. The trail was clean at first. Relay bounce, deep space handshake, standard encryption wrapper. But every time I followed it one step further back, I found another layer. Whoever had built this communication path had not wanted it found. They had buried it under 6 layers of signal masking, 2 dead-end relay loops designed to confuse automated trackers, and a frequency shift so subtle it had nearly fooled our own monitoring array into logging it as background radiation. I found it because I was very tired, and had nothing else to do, and I am, when it comes to signals, extremely stubborn. The origin tag at the bottom of the final layer was a 9-character alphanumeric string. I copied it onto a notepad and stared at it. Then I ran it through every database I had access to. Then I ran it through 3 databases I technically did not have access to, using authorization codes that a former colleague had left with me as a joke 2 years ago, saying I would never need them. Every search returned the same result. The string belonged to a project with no public name, No official budget allocation. No congressional or parliamentary record in any nation's archives that I could reach. But it had a designation. Buried inside the relay metadata, stamped at the system level where no human hand had placed it recently, was a single word. Ares. I wrote it down. I underlined it. I sat back and looked at the ceiling of the bunker, and thought about a set of coordinates sent to an alien empire at 4 in the morning, by something that called itself Ares, and had apparently been hiding from every government on the planet for long enough to build a secret deep space relay network. I did not sleep after that. There did not seem to be much point. They came for me at 6 in the morning, which I later learned was the exact time they came for everyone they wanted. Not a polite knock, not a message on the intercom. A man in a gray jacket appeared at the door of the monitoring room, said my name once, and held up a small card with a single symbol on it. The same 9-character string I had found the night before. Then he waited. I looked at Gary Pullman, still asleep in his chair. I looked at my cold coffee. I looked at the coordinates still on my screen, pointing to a dead star system 3 light-years off the Kethara approach vector. I stood up and followed the man in the gray jacket. He did not speak in the elevator. He did not speak in the corridor. He led me down 2 levels below the main bunker floor, through a security door that required both a retinal scan and a physical key, into a room I had not known existed. The room was large, clean, and very bright. A long table ran down its center. 8 people were already seated around it, and at the head of the table sat a woman named Harriet Cole. I did not know her name yet. I learned it when she introduced herself, which she did immediately, calmly, and without any preamble. "My name is Harriet Cole," she said. "I am the director of a program called the Asymmetric Response and Expeditionary Strategy Initiative. We call it Ares. You found our relay tag last night. That tells me you're the right person to be sitting in that chair. Good morning, Claire." She was somewhere in her late 50s, with gray hair cut close and the particular stillness of someone who had spent decades making decisions under enormous pressure. She did not look nervous. She did not look proud or triumphant. She looked like someone who had been preparing for a very long meeting and was relieved it had finally started. "You sent the coordinates," I said. "We did. Without authorization from any government." "That is correct. And the coordinates point to a star system with no habitable planets, no indigenous life, no strategic value to anyone except us," she said. "Sit down, Claire. I am going to tell you everything. We don't have very much time, and I need you to understand all of it, because in the next few weeks you are going to be the most important translator on this planet, and you cannot do that job if you don't understand what you're translating for." I sat down. What she told me over the next 4 hours rearranged everything I thought I understood about the past 40 years of human history. Ares had been started in 2031, not in response to the Kethara signal. That had arrived 3 days ago. Ares had been started because of something much quieter than a signal. In 2029, a deep space monitoring station in the outer asteroid belt had detected a gravitational anomaly that did not match any natural object in its catalog. It was faint. It lasted 11 minutes. It moved in a way that no comet or asteroid or rogue planet moved. Then it was gone. 2 astronomers filed a report. The report was classified within 48 hours by a joint intelligence committee that had been set up quietly and without public record specifically for this eventuality. Because there were people, even then, who had been thinking very carefully about what it would mean if humanity was not alone, and what it would mean if whoever else was out there found us before we were ready. Ares was their answer. Not a defense. That was the first thing Harriet made clear. A defense was something you built to resist an attack. Ares had not been built to resist anything. It had been built on a single foundational assumption, which was this: if a civilization advanced enough to cross interstellar space, arrived at Earth with hostile intentions, a conventional defense would fail. You could not outgun something that had been building warships for 3,000 years. You could not outmaneuver something that had crossed the distances between stars. You could not negotiate from weakness. The only option, the only one that had any statistical chance of success, was to change the nature of the engagement entirely. Ares had been built to ambush. 40 years. That was how long it had taken. 40 years of quiet, patient, extraordinarily expensive construction in the outer system, where no civilian telescope pointed, and no public satellite passed. Automated shipyards tucked behind the largest asteroids in the belt, running on solar collectors and building things at a rate that never spiked high enough to draw attention. Drone networks seeded into debris fields, programmed to stay cold and dark until a specific activation signal reached them. Kinetic platforms disguised as natural rocks, orbiting quietly in patterns that looked random from the outside, but were anything but. And at the center of it all, a star system 3 light-years off Earth. It had no name in any public catalog. Ares called it the Threshold. It was a dead system, one dim red dwarf circled by 4 rocky, airless planets and a wide debris field that stretched across the outer orbits. Nothing lived there. Nothing had ever lived there. But for the last 30 years, Ares had been filling it very carefully with things that were not natural. Gravitational mines buried in the debris field, keyed to the mass profile of Cathara ships, drone swarms in the hollow centers of 3 of the larger asteroids, dormant, waiting. A modified pulsar relay on the second planet's surface, capable of broadcasting a disruption field that would destabilize any faster-than-light drive that tried to engage within the system. The whole thing was designed to do one thing: catch a fleet in the moment of arrival, before it could reform, before it could establish a defensive perimeter, in the 1 second of vulnerability that any ship experienced when it came out of faster-than-light travel. That 1 second was everything. "We've been modeling this for 20 years, said a man at the table named Arthur Bridges, a compact, quiet engineer who headed Ares's Weapons Systems division. Faster-than-light exit creates a transition window. Your drives are recalibrating. Your sensors are recalibrating. Your crew, if you have one, is recovering from the transit. For approximately 1.2 seconds after exit, every ship that exists is essentially stationary and partially blind. 1 second is all we need." "You turned a whole star system into a trap," I said. "We turned a whole star system into the most expensive and precisely engineered trap in the history of our species," Arthur said. And he did not sound boastful. He sounded exhausted and a little sad and very determined. "We sent them the coordinates because we needed them to go there. We needed to choose the location. If we let them come to Earth first, we lose all of that. They arrive where they want, when they want, at a strength of their choosing. But if they go to the threshold, they go into a box," I said. "They go into a box," he confirmed. I thought about that for a moment. I thought about the Cathara signal, so clean and so certain, and the phrase that had stopped me cold 3 days ago: "You have been found insufficient for independent operation." 3,000 years of empire, 140 species, all of them absorbed, managed, reduced. All of them had done the same thing. They had tried to survive first contact. They had stalled or negotiated or defended. They had played on the Cathara's terms. "No one has ever done this before," I said. It was not a question. "No," said Harriet. "No species in the Cathara's history has ever responded to their ultimatum by sending them coordinates." "What did the other species send?" "Silence," she said, "or pleas, or offers of tribute. The ones that tried to fight did so defensively, at home, on ground the Cathara had already chosen. And we sent them directions. We sent them directions to a place where we had spent 40 years preparing to meet them," Harriet said. I sat with that. The logic of it was cold and clean and undeniable, and underneath the logic was something else. Something I couldn't quite name. Something that felt like the specific kind of human stubbornness that had gotten our species through every catastrophe we had ever caused ourselves. We had looked at a 3,000-year-old empire and decided that the right response was not to cower and not to beg and not to run. The right response was to write back and say, "Come here. Come to this specific place. We'll be waiting." "The moral question," I said carefully. Harriet looked at me without blinking. "You did this without authorization. No government approved this. No UN resolution. No democratic process. You made a decision on behalf of every human being on this planet, and you made it in secret, and you made it over 40 years while no one was watching. And now the clock has run out, and whatever happens next happens to all of us, not just Ares." Yes, Harriet said. That's all? Just yes? What would you like me to say, Claire? That I'm sorry? I'm not. That I would have done it differently if I had the choice. I wouldn't. What I can tell you is this. If I had gone to a government, any government, and told them what I wanted to build and why, one of two things would have happened. They would have said no, because the scale of the project was too large, and the timeline was too long, and no political body thinks in 40-year horizons. Or they would have said yes, and leaked it within a decade, because governments are composed of human beings, and human beings talk. If the Kethara had any intelligence capability pointed at Earth at all, and they did, we know they did, they would have found it. The trap only works because they don't know it's there. I could not argue with that. I wanted to, because the thing she was describing was a violation of every principle of democratic governance I had ever believed in, and I had believed in them sincerely. But the alternative she was describing was also real. I sat there for a long time in the bright, clean room, and I did not say anything. What do you need from me? I finally asked. The Kethara fleet will respond to those coordinates, Harriet said. We don't know exactly when. Based on our best modeling of their propulsion capacity, it will take between 18 and 30 hours for an advance element to reach the threshold. When they arrive, we will have telemetry from the threshold relay network. We will hear everything: their tactical communications, their status reports, their distress signals if there are any. All of it will be in Kethara language. We have basic translation frameworks built from the signal they sent us, but the tactical vocabulary is different from a formal ultimatum. It will be fast and compressed, and full of terms we don't have yet. You need me to translate in real time, I said. I need you to tell me what they're saying as they say it. I need to know the moment they realize what's happening. I need to know if they call for reinforcements, what size, and when. I need to know if any of their ships try to break out of the system. She paused. And I need you to translate what we send them afterward. Because if this works, and it will work, what comes next will require words, not weapons, and I need those words to be exactly right. She slid a folder across the table toward me. Inside was a language analysis packet 300 pages thick. Every fragment of Kethara communication that Ares had intercepted over the past 4 decades, catalogued and annotated, and partially decoded. 40 years of patient linguistic work, built on a signal that no one on the public record had ever been allowed to know existed. I picked it up, and I felt the weight of it, and I understood that I had just walked through a door that did not open from the other side. When do we start? I said. You already have, said Harriet Cole. I spent the next 14 hours in a room with 3 other linguists. A woman named Fiona Greer, who had built half the translation framework from scratch. A young man named Patrick Calloway, who could hold 7 simultaneous language structures in his head without notes. And an older man named Solomon Webb, who had spent 30 years studying xenolinguistics as an academic specialty that everyone had told him was completely pointless. For Solomon, this was the day his entire life had been waiting for. He was so calm it was almost strange. We worked through the night. The Kethara language, or at least the formal register they had used in the ultimatum, had a structure unlike any human language family I had ever encountered. It was not built around subjects and verbs in the way Indo-European languages were. It was built around states of being and their relationships to permanent facts. Kethara grammar treated conquered things as objects and everything else as potential objects not yet realized. There was no word in the formal register for an equal. There was a word that translated approximately as a temporary obstacle, and a word that translated as an entity of unknown category, but nothing in between. That gap in their vocabulary told me something important, something I filed away and returned to later. We were ready when the alert came. The Kethara advance fleet had reached the threshold. The telemetry room was a long, low space on the 3rd sublevel of the Ares facility, and it smelled like electronics and cold air, and the particular tension of people who had been waiting for something for a very long time, and were now watching it begin. Every surface was covered in screens, not the kind of screens you see in conference rooms. These were dense, layered, scrolling with data streams that came in across 6 different relay chains simultaneously. People sat at stations in 3 rows, heads down, headsets on, fingers moving without pause. I sat in the front row with Fiona and Patrick and Solomon, and I put on my headset, and I listened. The first Kethara transmission came through at 14 seconds after fleet arrival. It was short, confident. A status report, we determined. The Advance Fleet Commander announcing arrival at target coordinates, confirming formation integrity, beginning preliminary scan of the system. The voice had a quality I had not expected. It sounded bored, routine. This was, for them, another stop on a very long journey that had never surprised them yet. I wrote the translation on my pad in quick, clean letters and passed it to Harriet, who was standing directly behind me. Formation arrival confirmed, I said quietly into my headset. Commander designating this system as Category 4 survey. He's telling his ships to spread into standard assessment formation. They're not expecting anything. Good, Harriet said. She was very still. She had her hands clasped behind her back, and her eyes were fixed on the largest screen at the front of the room, which showed a schematic of the threshold system, with 200 small icons moving in slow spread formation across it. 34 seconds after arrival, the first mine activated. The gravitational mines were not explosive in any traditional sense. They were field generators, dense, compact machines buried in the debris field that could project a localized gravity distortion when triggered. In space, a sudden localized gravity spike does not cause an explosion. It causes something worse. It causes a ship's structural integrity to react to 2 contradictory gravitational pulls at once, and the reaction is instant and complete. 11 Kethara ships in the outer ring of the formation hit the first mine cluster simultaneously. The transmissions changed immediately. The boredom was gone. What replaced it was a specific quality of sound that I had no word for in any of our translation notes, because we had never heard it before in their language. It was fast, sharp, overlapping. Multiple voices cutting into each other in ways that violated the strict hierarchical communication protocols I had seen in the formal register. In Kethara hierarchy, subordinates waited. They did not speak over commanders. They were speaking over their commanders now. Multiple hull integrity alerts, I said, forcing my voice flat. Several ships reporting drive destabilization. The outer screen is breaking formation. Commander is... He's demanding a status report from the outer ships. He's not getting coherent answers. The second wave? Harriet asked quietly. Not yet in the translation. Wait. The drone swarms activated at 48 seconds. The drones were not large. They had been designed specifically not to be large, because large targets were targets that could be identified and destroyed before they reached effective range. Each drone was roughly the size of a human fist, made primarily of a radar-absorbing composite material, and armed with a directional electromagnetic pulse emitter, powerful enough to disable the navigation systems of a ship 10 times its size. There were approximately 400,000 of them spread across the 3 asteroid hollows in the system's inner belt, and they had been dormant for 11 years, and they woke up all at once. 400,000 small, cold, fast, angry things, coming out of the dark from 3 directions at once. The Kethara tactical chatter became, very briefly, extremely loud. They see them, Patrick said from beside me, faster than I could get there. He had caught the targeting terminology before I did. They're trying to bring point defense online. Commander is ordering a 180-degree reorientation. He wants the fleet to face the incoming swarm. He's pulling the outer ships inward. He's pulling them off the minefield, Arthur Bridges asked from across the room. He doesn't know the minefield is there, I said. He just saw the drones come out of the asteroid belt, and he's turning to face them. He's doing exactly what any competent commander would do. Which means the inner formation is now moving through the primary mine zone, Arthur said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite satisfaction and not quite grief. It was the sound of a man watching a plan work exactly as designed, understanding what that meant for the things on the other side of it. The second mine cluster triggered at 59 seconds. The Kethara transmissions in the minute that followed were unlike anything in our translation database. The structured, hierarchical precision of their communication collapsed entirely. Individual ship commanders were broadcasting without waiting for authorization. The fleet frequency, normally a single clear channel with strict traffic discipline, became a layered mess of overlapping voices, and underneath them all was a sound I had not expected, something that translated, very approximately, as a request for confirmation that this was happening. They were asking each other if this was real. I understood, in that moment, something important about the Kethara. They were not unprepared in any conventional sense. They were competent and organized and experienced. What they lacked, what 3,000 years of uninterrupted success had taken from them, was the mental framework for a situation they had never encountered. They had protocols for resistance. They had protocols for defense. They had protocols for a species that fought back from its home planet with whatever weapons it had managed to build. They did not have a protocol for arriving at coordinates that had been provided by the enemy and finding that those coordinates were a prepared killing field. The concept did not exist in their tactical doctrine. It had never needed to. "The pulsar relay is active," said a technician at the end of the row. The relay on the second planet's surface was the final piece. It broadcast a disruption field, tuned to the specific frequency range of Kethara, faster-than-light drives, information extracted painstakingly from 40 years of intercepted technical transmissions. While the relay was active, no ship in the threshold system could engage an FTL drive. They could not run. The only way out was conventional thrust, through a debris field seeded with mines, under fire from 400,000 drones coming from 3 directions. The Kethara fleet commander made a decision at 72 seconds that I thought, afterward, was actually the best decision available to him in an impossible situation. He ordered the surviving formation to consolidate around the 3 largest remaining warships, concentrate point defense fire on the drone swarms, and push in a single vector toward the system's edge at maximum conventional thrust. He was trying to break out. He was accepting losses and giving up the scattered formation and pushing for distance, because distance was the only thing that would eventually get his ships clear of the relay's range. It was a good plan. It was the right plan, given what he had. It did not work because the drone swarms had been programmed for exactly this response. The consolidation move that brought the surviving ships together also brought them together within the operational radius of the 3rd asteroid's drone hollow, which had not yet opened. It opened now. I heard the commander's voice change. In all the chaos of the transmission, his voice had stayed controlled. Command voice. I recognized it across species. It had a quality that was unmistakable. He had been giving clear orders in deteriorating conditions, and his voice had not broken once. I respected that, in the way you can respect something and oppose it completely at the same time. When the 3rd swarm came out of the dark, his voice changed. Not to fear. The Kethara word that came through was one Solomon had flagged in the translation notes weeks ago with a question mark, because it did not map cleanly to any human concept. Solomon had tentatively translated it as a state of recognition that a situation is outside all known categories. "What did he just say?" Harriet asked. She had been watching my face. "He said something we don't have a good word for," I told her. "The closest I can get is, he told his crew that they were somewhere he had never been before." Harriet nodded once and looked back at the screen. The battle, if you could call it a battle, which I was not sure you could, because a battle implies 2 sides fighting, and what happened in the threshold was closer to a reckoning than a fight, lasted 19 minutes from the first mine activation. At the end of those 19 minutes, of the 200 Kethara ships that had entered the system, 160 were completely disabled. Their power systems were down, their drives were dead, and they were drifting in the debris field. The other 40 had managed to get clear of the relay's range and engaged their FTL drives, and they were gone. Gone, as Harriet had predicted they would be, not destroyed, not captured, but running, carrying something home that was more valuable to us than their destruction would have been. Information. "What did we lose?" Harriet asked Arthur, and her voice had not changed at all. Arthur looked at his pad. "Station 7 is fully offline. The Eastern drone net took significant losses from Kethara point defense. We're at approximately 60% operational capacity there. 11 relay nodes in the outer debris ring are destroyed. He paused. No human casualties. All systems were automated. No human casualties. I turned those words over in my head. 40 years of preparation, and the first genuine engagement between humanity and an interstellar empire had produced no human casualties. That was not luck. That was engineering. That was the specific result of building your trap correctly and on the right terms. Start recovery and reconstruction protocols on Station 7, Harriet said. I want the outer relay ring back to 80% within 2 weeks. Yes, Director. And begin assembling the follow-on transmission package. She turned to look at me directly. Claire, this is where your job changes. I set down my translation pad. My hand was shaking very slightly. I had not noticed until that moment. The 40 ships that escaped, I said. They're going back to Cathara High Command. Yes. With everything they recorded. Every second of what happened. Yes. And the Cathara High Command is going to look at those recordings, and they are going to know that we built that trap, that we invited them to it, that we gave them the coordinates ourselves. Yes, Harriet said. And in the next 24 to 72 hours, they are going to make a decision about what to do with that information. They are going to debate whether to send a larger fleet or whether to try something else. And the transmission we send them in the next few hours is going to influence that decision significantly. So I need you to think very carefully about language, Claire, because the wrong word in the wrong register at this moment is not a diplomatic mistake. It is a strategic one. I picked up the translation notes. My hand had stopped shaking. Tell me what you want to say to them, I said. I want to say, Harriet said, precisely and quietly, that we are still here, that we know what they are, that we know what they have done to 140 other species, and that we are not those species, and that we would like to have a conversation. I looked at her for a moment. A conversation. A real one. Not a surrender process. A conversation between two parties who have now demonstrated, fairly clearly, that neither one can simply remove the other without cost. She paused. I want them to understand that we chose this, that we knew what we were doing, that the coordinates were an invitation with full knowledge of consequences, and that we are extending a second invitation now, one that goes in a different direction. You want them to be uncertain, I said. You want them to not know what we are. I want them to be curious, Harriet said. Uncertain entities get destroyed as a precaution. Curious entities get studied. I want them to need to understand us more than they need to defeat us. I thought about the gap in their vocabulary. No word for an equal. A word for a temporary obstacle, and a word for an entity of unknown category. I thought about which of those two categories I wanted us to occupy. I opened to a blank page in my translation pad, and I began to write. The message took 4 hours. Every word was chosen by committee. Myself, and Fiona, and Patrick, and Solomon, and Harriet, and Arthur, all of us arguing in low voices over shading, and implication, and register. In Cathara, formal language, the choice between two nearly synonymous words could carry the difference between a statement of defiance and a statement of invitation. We needed both at once, and they had to be indistinguishable from each other. When it was done, it was 6 sentences long. Solomon transmitted it at 03:17 in the morning from the same deep space relay that had sent the first set of coordinates. Then we waited. 72 hours passed, and the Cathara said nothing. I know, because I was monitoring every frequency the entire time. The team ran in shifts, 6 hours on, 3 hours off, but I did not take my full off hours. I slept in the chair beside my station, with one earpiece in, and I woke up every time the background signal frequency changed, which happened 11 times in those 72 hours, and meant nothing 11 times. I was running on bad food from a vending machine 2 floors up, and the kind of alert, wired exhaustion that comes from adrenaline extended past its natural lifespan, and I did not leave the building. On hour 73, Harriet came and sat beside me and handed me a cup of actual hot coffee and said, The silence is the answer, Claire. You understand that. I did understand it. I had been sitting with it for 3 days. The Cathara had not sent a second fleet. They had not repeated the original ultimatum. They had not gone quiet in the way a force goes quiet before a strike. There were specific signal patterns associated with that, according to the Ares Intercept archives, and none of them were present. The silence was not the absence of a decision. It was a decision in progress. Something was being argued about, somewhere in the Cathara High Command, and whatever it was taking longer than their standard response protocols. That was significant. Standard response protocols, according to 40 years of Ares analysis, were fast. The Cathara Directorate was old and organized, and they had procedures for everything. When a species resisted, there was a response timeline. When a species resistance failed, there was a response timeline. There was no procedure listed in any of their intercepted operational documents for a species that sent coordinates to a trap, defeated your advance fleet in 19 minutes, and then sent you a politely worded 6-sentence message asking if you'd like to talk. The absence of a procedure was creating a delay, and the delay was creating something inside Cathara High Command that their system was not built to handle well. Debate. On hour 78 I got something. Not from the Cathara Directorate. From 3 different points in space, all of them well outside the solar system, all of them using frequencies and encoding methods that were completely unlike the formal Cathara transmission standard I had been working with. I almost missed them. They were very faint. Patrick caught one of them while I was on a rest break, and I was back at my station within 2 minutes of him sending the alert. They were short. Each one was a burst transmission, compressed, and they had been routed through relay chains that bore no resemblance to Cathara standard infrastructure. They looked like amateur radio work, improvised, patched together, using what was available. The coding was nothing we had seen before. But the language inside them, when I stripped out the technical noise and looked at the signal core, was recognizable. Not Cathara formal, not Cathara tactical, something else, something older, more worn, more compressed, like the same root language spoken by people who had been using it in secret for a very long time, in short bursts, where every word had to carry maximum meaning because there was no room for waste. It took Solomon 6 hours to build a working framework. When he did, we sat together and read the 3 transmissions. They were from 3 different species. We did not know their names, and the transmissions did not provide them. What they provided were 3 things. The current location of a Cathara resupply fleet serving a sector 200 light-years away, a partial schematic of what appeared to be a Cathara command ship's internal layout, and a list of 22 star systems with notes on each one that Solomon translated, after careful work, as where we are and what they tell us to do there. They were client races, species that the Cathara had pacified and managed, possibly for centuries. They lived under the Directorate's organization, their military capacity removed, their development controlled, their resources allocated by administrators they had not chosen. They had watched 40 ships come home from the threshold, and they had, apparently, drawn conclusions. They were not offering alliance. There was no declaration of solidarity in any of the 3 transmissions, no emotional appeal, no shared enemy framing. What they had sent was pure information, useful information. Information that, in the hands of the right people, had genuine strategic value. Harriet looked at the 3 translations for a long time without speaking. "They're not risking themselves," she said finally. "If any of this is traced back to them, they're in trouble, but they sent it anyway." "They've been waiting," Solomon said simply. He was looking at his notes with an expression I recognized as the look of a man confirming a theory he had held for 30 years. "They've been waiting for someone to do what we did, not because they thought it would work, because they needed proof that it was possible to do it at all." Harriet set the translations down. "Does this change our response to the Directorate?" "No," I said, "but it changes what we're negotiating for." She looked at me. "If we negotiate for Earth's safety," I said, "we get Earth's safety. If the Directorate backs off, leaves us alone, establishes some kind of separation or treaty, that's the outcome. Earth is fine. Everything else stays the same. 140 managed species stay managed. Whatever these three are, I gestured at Solomon's translations, they stay where they are. And if we negotiate for something larger, Harriet said, then we need to be very precise about what we're asking for, I said, because the Cathera are not going to give us anything they haven't been pushed to give. We have one moment of leverage, one event that demonstrated we are not like the others. If we spend that leverage on Earth alone, it stays spent. The room was quiet. You are describing, Harriet said carefully, a negotiating position that goes significantly beyond this planet's immediate interests. I'm describing the only negotiating position that means anything, I said. Earth is safe, as long as we're dangerous. But danger fades. Technology ages. The Cathara are patient, and they have 3,000 years of experience waiting for dangers to become manageable. If the only thing we have is the memory of the threshold, it will be enough for 50 years, maybe 100, and then it won't. What do you want us to ask for? Arthur said from across the table. A seat, I said. Not a territory. Not a tribute payment or a non-aggression zone or any other arrangement that treats us as a subordinate party who got lucky once. A seat at whatever deliberative body the Cathera use to make decisions about which species fall under their authority. Veto power over pacification decisions. A formal structural role in their governance that costs them something real to grant and costs them something real to remove. They will never agree to that, Arthur said. They might not agree to it now, I said, but they sent us an ultimatum, and we sent them coordinates, and now they have been silent for 78 hours, which means they are in a conversation with themselves that they were not supposed to be having. That conversation is evidence that our leverage is real. The question is whether we spend it on something that lasts, or something that makes us comfortable for a generation. I looked at Harriet. She was looking at me with an expression I could not read. How long have you been thinking about this? She said. Since about hour 20 in the translation room, I said. There's a gap in their vocabulary. In the formal register, there is no word for a peer. There are words for subordinates, for threats, for entities not yet categorized. But no peer, no equal. The concept does not exist in their formal political language. Which means what? Which means their entire legal and administrative structure does not have a framework for it. If we ask to be equals and they agree, even partially, even in a limited and defined context, we are not filling an existing role in their system. We are creating a new category, and once a category exists in a language and a legal structure, it becomes available to others. The room was very quiet. The three species who sent us information, Fiona said from the end of the table. They would be watching, I said, and they would know. Harriet picked up the translations again. She read through them slowly. The room waited. Outside the facility, far above us, the sun had come up over Geneva, and the city was doing what it always did, continuing. All right, Harriet said. Then we write a second message. Before we could do that, however, a door that had been shut for 80 hours opened. The news broke at noon on the fourth day after the Cathera ultimatum. Not through a press release or a government announcement. Through a recording. Someone in the lower floors of the UN bunker in Geneva had been keeping a private audio log, and that log had been sent to a journalist. And by the time Harriet's communications team found out about it, the story was already moving across every major network on the planet. The story was not the threshold battle. The recording did not have access to that. What it had was the original Ares reveal meeting. Specifically, a fragment of Harriet's voice confirming that a secret program had sent an unauthorized response to the alien ultimatum on behalf of all humanity without any government's knowledge. Within 4 hours of broadcast, 14 governments had filed formal requests with the UN Security Council demanding a full inquiry. 3 heads of state made public statements. 2 of them used the word reckless. 1 used a word that was more heated than that. Social media was a wall of noise that I deliberately did not read. Harriet was summoned to an emergency UN session. She went. She took me with her. Because she said she needed her translator present, And I think she also needed someone in the room who understood what she had actually done and why. The session was held in the main chamber. The chamber was full. I sat behind Harriet at the witness table and watched the faces of ambassadors and ministers and representatives from every corner of the planet. And what I saw in those faces was a specific mixture that I recognized from my years of watching people receive news they were not prepared for: fear, relief, anger, and a helpless, grudging, furious awareness that something had been done that could not be undone and had, so far, not ended in catastrophe. Harriet did not apologize. I want to be precise about that, because it matters. She was direct and she was clear, and she was, at every moment, completely honest about what Aries was, about what she had done, about why, and about what had happened at the threshold. She did not use softening language. She did not say that she regretted the lack of oversight, while implying she would have sought it. She said, a vote would have leaked. A leak would have ended the mission. The mission was necessary because the alternative was a 3,000-year-old empire absorbing us into a managed population of resource providers with no independent future. She had made a choice in the only way that gave the choice any chance of succeeding. Then she answered every question that was put to her. There were many questions. They lasted 4 hours. Afterward, walking back through the corridor toward the secure elevator, I asked her how she felt. Tired, she said. You? The same. I paused. They're angry. Yes. Some of them think you had no right. Some of them are correct, she said. I didn't have the right in any procedural sense. I had something else. What? She considered. The math, she said finally. The math said that the authorized path failed with high probability, and the unauthorized path succeeded with reasonable probability. And I chose the path that kept the species alive. That is not a right. It is a decision. I'll carry it either way. We reached the elevator. The door opened. The second message, I said. We still need to write it. I know, Harriet said. Tonight. What's the word? I asked. The one you want to send them. The one after the coordinates. She stepped into the elevator. The door began to close. Home, she said. We sent them Earth's coordinates at 11:48 on a Wednesday night, 3 weeks and 2 days after the Cathara fleet had arrived at the threshold and not come home. It was not reckless. I want to be specific about that, because when people later described what we had done, the word reckless came up frequently, and it was wrong. Every decision in the Aries framework had been made with precise and careful attention to consequence. Sending our actual location was not bravado. It was a calculated statement. We know what you know. We know you can find us anyway. And we are choosing to give you this openly, because the gesture means something different when it is voluntary. Attached to the coordinates was the second message. It was longer than the first. We had worked on it for 9 hours, the 5 of us in the translation room, going word by word through every phrase in a language that had no structure for the concept of a peer. We had to build the concept from components that already existed in their vocabulary. We used the words for entity of unknown category and permanent facts and state of being in a way that no Cathara formal document had ever used them together. Solomon called it syntactic sculpture. Fiona called it the most stressful writing session of her life. Patrick said nothing. He was still holding his head in his hands from hour 7 onward, which was how he processed things. When it was done, the message said, Informal Cathara Register, something that translated approximately as this. We are the species you addressed at the beginning of this exchange. We are located at the attached coordinates. We are aware that you can identify our location by other means, and we offer this openly, as a demonstration of intentional disclosure, which in your language carries the legal weight of a formal declaration of status. We are declaring our status. We are not a threat not yet addressed. We are not a temporary obstacle. We are not a species awaiting categorization. We are a party to this conversation, and we would like to continue it here, at our location, on terms that recognize this description as accurate. We will receive an envoy. That last sentence had taken 2 hours on its own. In Cathara formal language, The phrasing of an invitation was layered with implicit hierarchy. You could phrase an invitation as a summons, which positioned the speaker above the recipient. You could phrase it as a petition, which positioned the speaker below. We needed something that existed in neither position, an invitation between parties of stated mutual standing. The language did not have a standard form for it. We built one. Solomon was not sure it would parse correctly to a native reader. Fiona said it would parse correctly. It would simply parse as unprecedented, and unprecedented was what we were going for. We sent it, and we waited again. This time the silence lasted 11 days. 11 days in which the world did not exactly calm down but reached a sort of exhausted equilibrium. The UN inquiry into Ares was still ongoing. 3 governments had officially protested. 2 others had quietly asked Harriet for a private briefing on the program's full technical capacity, which she gave, and which resulted in those governments going considerably more quiet than before. Public opinion, measured imprecisely by the tools available to measure such things, was something like divided, afraid, and cautiously aware that things could have gone worse. I went home for 3 of those 11 days. My apartment in Geneva was smaller than the Ares facility and had better light, and I stood at my kitchen window every morning with coffee and looked at the Alps on the horizon and tried to feel something uncomplicated. It was harder than it should have been. I had a younger brother named Owen who called me on the 2nd day. He lived in Edinburgh and taught secondary school history and had always been, of the 2 of us, the one who dealt better with uncertainty. He asked me if I could tell him what was happening. I said not entirely. He said he had watched the news coverage, and the thing that seemed clearest to him was that someone had done something very large and very fast and very unauthorized, and that it appeared to have worked, and that he was not sure whether to be relieved or concerned about what that implied for how the world worked. I told him I had been thinking about the same question. He asked if I was safe. I said yes. He asked if everyone was safe. I said I thought so, for now. He said that was probably the best answer available under the circumstances, and he was right. On the 12th day, a signal came. Not through the relay network, not through any of the monitored frequencies or the deep space antenna arrays or the satellite chains. The signal came direct, a tight beam transmission, aimed at Earth's surface, with a precision that required exact knowledge of our planet's position, rotation, and orbital location, down to fractions of a degree. It arrived at the main Ares receiving station in Iceland at 06:14 in the morning, local time, and it woke up half the team before the alert even finished sounding. The Cathara Directorate had received our message. The signal was not an ultimatum. It was not a demand. It was not a threat. It was, as far as I could determine from 3 readings and a hurried consultation with Fiona, a formal acknowledgement of communication status. In Cathara legal terms, this was not a small thing. An acknowledgement of communication status meant that the Directorate had classified the exchange as an active dialogue under formal protocols. It meant the conversation we had asked for was, in their legal framework, now open. At the end of the acknowledgement, there were 3 short sentences that I read 4 times before I believed what I was reading. The first said that a designated representative of the Cathara Directorate would travel to the coordinates provided. The second said that this representative held full authority to conduct dialogue on the Directorate's behalf. The third said that the Directorate had noted our use of a new syntactic construction in the previous message, and was attaching a question: had the construction been deliberate? Solomon laughed out loud when I translated that to the room. It was the first time I had heard him laugh in 3 weeks, and it was a full, genuine laugh, the kind that only emerges when tension has been held too long, and something unexpected breaks it. "They noticed," he said. "They noticed," I agreed. We replied within the hour. "Yes," I wrote. "The construction was deliberate. We would be glad to explain its intended meaning in detail upon your representative's arrival." The ship came into our solar system 22 days later. It came through the monitoring station's long-range detection array first, a contact moving at a velocity consistent with deceleration from FTL, on a direct trajectory from the general direction of Cathara territory. The contact was single, one ship, Every orbital defense system Ares had maintained above and around Earth had been quietly moved to passive status. Not because Harriet was naive, but because an active defense posture in the moment of a diplomatic approach was a message. And it was not the message we wanted to send right now. The ship decelerated into the outer system and waited. It broadcast a single short transmission on the acknowledged frequency, using the communication status identifier we had established. It was waiting for permission to approach. Harriet looked at me across the table in the briefing room. "That's new," I said. "For them." "Asking permission," she said. "Asking permission." She nodded once. "Tell them yes." The ship came to orbital distance and held position above Earth's equatorial plane. It was not what I had imagined, though I could not have said what I had imagined instead. It was large, but not ostentatiously so, roughly 3 times the length of the largest human-built structure that had ever been placed in orbit. Its surface was dark and smooth, with a geometry that suggested function rather than display. It had no weapons visible, though I was not naive enough to assume that meant it had none. We went up to meet it. When I say we, I mean a delegation of 6. Harriet, myself, Solomon, Arthur, and 2 representatives from the UN. An ambassador named Victor Crane, who had been specifically selected for this, because he had spent 30 years as a multilateral negotiator and did not, as Harriet put it, rattle easily. And a woman named Lydia Park from the General Assembly's Committee on Emerging International Frameworks, who was there because she had written the only existing theoretical paper on how human legal structures might be adapted for interspecies diplomacy. We went up in an Ares shuttle, docked at a port the Kethara ship had opened without being asked to, and were escorted inside by 2 beings who did not speak, who were taller than any human I had ever stood near, and who moved with the particular precision of creatures for whom every motion was intentional. The Kethara envoy was waiting in a room that had been arranged, clearly and deliberately, in a configuration that resembled a meeting space. Not a throne room, not a command center. A meeting space. 2 sides of a table, each with seating scaled to the occupants on that side. The envoy's name, the transliteration I worked out over the following weeks, was something close to Varric. He was old, not in the way that humans become old, which usually involves visible wear and diminished energy, but in a way that read as accumulated time, a quality of stillness and attention that felt geologic. He had been, according to what I was later able to establish, in some kind of senior diplomatic or administrative role within the Kethara Directorate for over 300 years. He looked at me for a long moment when we were introduced. "You wrote the second message," he said, through the translation device we had built into the table, a piece of hardware Solomon had spent 2 weeks assembling. The words were clear. "Yes," I said. "The syntactic construction. The new form." "Yes." "Explain it," he said, not rudely, with genuine interest, the kind of interest that is more demanding than politeness. "In your formal register," I said, "an invitation positions the speaker in relation to the recipient, above or below. Your language has not had a reason to develop a horizontal form, because your interactions with other species have always been vertical." Varric was very still. "We needed a horizontal form," I said, "so we built one from the components available. We used the word for permanent facts, because a permanent fact is fixed and does not change regardless of the observer's position. We combined it with the state of being construction that implies mutual recognition. The result was imprecise by your standards, but it was intentional, and the intention was to describe 2 parties who are neither above nor below each other in this exchange." A long pause. "This is not a category that exists in our legal framework," Varric said. "No," I agreed. "We know. We are asking you to create it." He was quiet for what felt like a very long time. Victor Crane was sitting perfectly still to my left. Harriet was sitting perfectly still to my right. The room had the particular quality of a moment that is being experienced as significant by everyone present simultaneously. "The threshold," Varric said. "Yes. You built it knowing we would come. We built it, hoping we would have the choice of where to send you. We hoped for a long time that the choice would never need to be made. But you prepared as though it would. Yes, I said. For 40 years. Yes. Another pause. Our records, Varric said, show that the species we have encountered who prepared most carefully for our arrival were the ones most afraid. We were afraid, I said. Preparation and fear are not opposites. And the ones who invited us to specific coordinates, he continued, of which there have been none prior to this exchange, were presumably in a different state of mind, I said. What state of mind? Varric asked. I had thought about how to answer that question since the night we sent the first coordinates. I had turned it over and looked at it from different angles and tested different words against it in different languages. I had a word in English, and I had spent several weeks building a Kethara equivalent. Decided, I said. In the Kethara construction I had prepared, it came through as something closer to a permanent fact about one's own nature, reached without external pressure and maintained without revision. In their vocabulary, that was a legal category. It described the constitutional principles of the Directorate itself, the things that did not change. I had called us a constitutional fact. Varric looked at me for a very long time. Then he said, "Informal Kethara register," a phrase that Solomon turned to me with wide eyes to confirm the translation of, because neither of us quite believed it. It translated as, "That construction may have merit." The negotiations lasted 4 months. Not 4 months of every day, but 4 months of sessions held in the ship above Earth, and in a converted facility in Geneva, and, in 3 cases, via transmission, when Varric needed to consult with the Directorate, and the distances involved made physical presence impractical. Victor Crane was brilliant in those sessions. Not aggressive, not deferential, but precise and patient, and absolutely clear about what was being asked, and why. What we asked for, in the end, was this: a formal consultative role in the Directorate's review process for new species contact, not a veto in absolute terms, because the Kethara would not grant an absolute veto, and asking for one would have ended the negotiation. What we got was a mandatory consultation period. Any species identified for potential contact had to be reviewed by a joint panel that included a human representative before pacification procedures could be initiated. The panel's recommendation was not binding, but the Directorate was required to respond formally to any objection raised, in writing, within their legal record. It was not everything. Lydia Park told me privately that in terms of international law precedents, it was remarkable. In terms of what we had hoped for at the very beginning of the conversation, it was a starting point. Varric told me, in one of the last sessions, that the Directorate had reviewed the threshold records extensively. Your drone network suffered significant losses, he said. Yes. Your automated stations took considerable damage. Yes. You sustained no living casualties. No. This was intentional, he said. We were not interested in being heroic, I said. We were interested in being right. He made a sound that I had come to recognize over 4 months of translation work as something approximating acknowledgement. The 3 communications you received, he said, from species under our administration. I looked at him carefully. Yes. We are aware of them, Varric said. We have been aware of them since they were sent. We chose not to act on that awareness. I considered what he was telling me, and what he was not telling me. The panel, I said, when it reviews cases, would those species be eligible for a different classification status if a formal objection were raised? Varric looked at me for a long moment. The panel reviews new cases, he said carefully. And if existing cases were formally revisited on the basis of new information? Another long pause. The legal structure, he said, would need to be examined for applicable precedent. I nodded. We would be glad to help examine it, I said. He left 4 days after that session. The ship pulled away from Earth's orbit on a clear morning in November, and I watched it from the observation deck of Geneva Station, the new orbital platform that had been the first publicly announced product of the Ares program, a gesture of transparency that Harriet had insisted on. Behind the Kethara ship, moving at a respectful distance as though uncertain of their own position, were 3 other ships, small ones, Nothing like warships. They had arrived 2 days before, and they had not broadcast on any standard channel. They had sent a single tight beam transmission to the Ares relay network, in a compressed version of the same improvised language we had decoded weeks ago. Solomon had translated it in 20 minutes. It said, "We would like to speak with you about what happens next." They were not declaring independence. They were not announcing a revolution. They were asking a question. A real question, tentatively, in a voice that carried the specific weight of something spoken for the first time, after a very long time of silence. I was still working on the response when Harriet came to stand beside me at the observation deck window. She had a coffee, which she handed me without asking. "How many languages can you hold in your head at once?" she asked. 7, comfortably. 9 if I haven't slept. "And the Kethara register?" "Fluently, as of about 6 weeks ago." "The 3 new ones?" "Frameworks only so far. I need another 2 months." She was quiet for a moment, watching the ships. "We did something that has never been done before," she said. Not proudly. Observationally. The way you would note a fact. "We sent directions," I said. "We sent directions," she agreed. "To a place we had prepared. And then we sent a word." "Conversation," I said. It was the right word. I looked at the 3 small ships, hanging in the dark above the planet, waiting for an answer. I thought about the legal structure that needed to be examined for applicable precedent. I thought about 40 years of patient, stubborn, unauthorized preparation by people who had decided, before the choice was necessary, who they were and what they would not become. I thought about Owen in Edinburgh, teaching history to teenagers, and the question he had asked, should I be relieved or concerned? Both, I had wanted to tell him. Hold both at once. It is the only honest answer, and it is also the one that keeps you working. I turned away from the window and went back to my desk. 3 new languages were waiting. The response needed to be right. In this particular kind of conversation, the words were not secondary to the strategy. They were the strategy. I sat down, opened my notebook to a blank page, and started writing.